Good morning, everyone. Hello, and welcome to this National Press Foundation webinar. We're going to talk today about a very difficult topic, reporting on rape and sexual assault. I'm Linda Topping-Streitfeld. I'm the Director of Programs for the National Press Foundation. The NPF is a nonprofit. We're based here in Washington, D.C., and our mission is to improve the work of journal topics like this one. We have to 4 days, and we pay all expenses for journalists in some of our longer programs. If you might be interested in those, I urge you to go to our website, which is www.nationalpress.org. You can sign by putting your email address into the social media box. We hope that all of you watching today will participate in this webinar by chatting your questions. Just type them into the chat window, which you should find on the right side of your screen. I'll be monitoring the questions here, and we will get to as many as we have time for. By tomorrow, we expect to have a link on our website to the recorded version of this webinar. So if you'd like to share it with a friend, you can do that. And again, you'll find it on our website, nationalpress.org. So again, this is a difficult topic today, and I'm very pleased to have with me to help us deal with it two wonderful, intelligent women. First, Melinda Henneberger, a Washington Post political reporter and also the anchor for the paper's She the People blog. Thank you, Melinda. Also, Stella Mukasa. She is the Director of Gender, Violence, and Rights at the International Center for Research on Women. And we're very pleased to have you, especially since I believe much of our audience today is an international audience, and I think that we're going to be able to address both domestic and international issues. The numbers on rape are, of course, very distressing. In the U.S., a rape is reported about every 6 minutes, and we know that many rapes, maybe as many as half, are never reported. Melinda, who are the victims of rape?
Overwhelmingly women and girls, and many under the age of 30. That's the most common demo. But, of course, boys and men are too sometimes raped. I think, though, we still have no idea about the prevalence of this serious crime. You know, 1 out of every 6 women will be the victim of sexual assault or rape at some point in their life. That's in the United States. And, you know, I was listening just today on the radio that the United Nations says there are some countries, and I'm sure you'll talk about this, in which the prevalence is in some places as high as 70%. So I think we still think of it as this quite rare event. And I was reminded of that recently, a couple months ago, when in the newsroom we were after the Republican candidate for Senate from Indiana, Richard Murdoch, made some unfortunate remarks about rape. One of my editors called and said, you know, it would be great to interview someone who's actually been raped. I guess you've got to go to a, you know, maybe the idea was, you know, we'll really have to get out and beat the bushes to find such a person. So, you know, maybe visit a rape crisis center. Where can we find someone to talk to? And that's when I ended up, after all these years, 27 years later, writing about my own rape, which was largely to say, you know, we define, there are many, many, many women who've had this experience and whose lives have not been defined by this experience.
Very important point to make. Stella, what's the international situation?
I would say the international perspective to this is the same, that it's mainly women and girls who are experiencing rape and other forms of sexual violence. Perhaps I would like to emphasize here that the data strongly suggests that a large number of women who experience violence, sexual violence, are actually experiencing it from their partners. And as intimate partner violence, so coerced sexual intercourse. And in many countries around the world, marital rape is not yet recognized as a criminal offense. Then, of course, there are other types of rape that are occasioned as a result of observing certain cultural practices. And, you know, those ones also tend to affect young women, young girls. You know, issues such as early marriage are definitely resulting into sexual assault for the young women involved. Then there's the perspective of rape as a weapon of war, where you find that many times women in a given conflict, and in that case also men become victims of sexual assault and violence as part of humiliation to push further an agenda of war. That's really what I would have to say.
This is a very multi-layered topic. How is the press doing? How is our coverage? Are we doing any better? Are there places we can improve? Melinda, what do you think?
I always see room for improvement. I'm sure that we're doing better in speaking about it more, but I still think we look at it, as I said before, as an all too rarefied experience, and something we were talking about before. When we look at these incredibly horrific cases, these very dramatic cases, like the one that happened, the horrible, brutal rape of this woman in New Delhi on a bus, who later died in Singapore. I think that focusing only on these cases, and you were making this point, Stella, really does make us think of rape as a more rare event, and as and it keeps us from thinking that this is such an everyday thing. Think that if you weren't brutalized and your life is over, then maybe you weren't raped. And when I look at the coverage, one thing that I see as a trend is that we tend to do much better of coverage of these attacks when they happen someplace else. So I don't think it's any accident that the coverage of this horrific case in Steubenville, Ohio, that was covered first by the Cleveland Plain Dealer, and later that story was echoed in the New York Times. The case I've written about at the University of Notre Dame of a sexual assault and of another rape there by alleged against 2 football players currently on the team. I think it's no accident that the head of the university gave his only interview to the hometown paper, the South Bend Tribune, or that case was first broken in the Chicago Tribune. So I think that's something that, because of defensiveness toward someone in the community, particularly if they're well known or if they're an athlete, then there's that perhaps natural defensiveness that you have to be on guard against, I think, in coverage.
Absolutely. Any thoughts?
Perhaps just to add, again from an international perspective, looking at communities and societies and the value attached to women and girls and their dignity informs a lot how the reporting happens. So that, again, going back to a reference to the horrific issues, when you read the press report, they're actually reporting the murder, and in the process of reading about the murder, you realize that this victim was actually also sexually assaulted, and therefore the reporting on rape, sexual assault is more or less secondary, as not as big an issue, and that's tends to be the trend and the tendency that could be improved. The other element that I would probably like to put on the table here is the question of reporters being able to draw out some of the positive efforts that are ongoing to address rape, approaches that are working, strategies, programs, which is also part and parcel of placing this in a wider context of people recognizing that rape, is commonplace, and there are places that people can go to seek help rather than withdraw.
Okay, so this is an important point. Beyond just focusing on the horror of the rape, reporters can look for programs that are working, things that are helping. And we may have more of an opportunity to talk about that in a little bit, but I think that's an important point. Now, what about the legal system? Today in the New York Times, there's an editorial referencing the New Delhi rape in which they talk about problems with the legal system that threaten the prosecution of these of the alleged perpetrators. Can you talk about that at all? What are sort of some overarching issues with the legal system?
Okay. Well, while I may not be speaking authoritatively on India now, I can imagine that the question of collecting credible evidence that will make a strong case before court becomes a very big problem. You have regulations that require, in many countries, that this kind of evidence and exam is conducted by a recognized and certified person, official or professional. In many countries they're called police surgeons, and they're very rare to find. So that if you don't get that kind of evidence filled in on police form 3 or something like that, you know, you will not be able to present credible evidence before court. And many countries are taking efforts to amend this so that, you know, an ordinary medical doctor or personnel can be able to gather this kind of evidence. You know, other obstacles include the issue of attitudes and how, you know, officials, especially in the police and justice system, perceive rape and sexual assault and their attitudes towards the victim or the survivor in that case. There's the issue of logistics and, you know, institutional bottlenecks, which would cause delays, you know, and the case being part of a whole huge backlog within the system. So those are some of the challenges that one would encounter.
And so what about in the U.S.? Are we doing any better over here?
I would say that when you compare us to a system such as the one in India that unfortunately because of this horrible case I've learned has a really disgusting situation where the sexual so-called laxness of the woman, which to be determined by a doctor, means that if you're found to be sexually active, you really can't be raped. I mean, that's, thank goodness, there's nothing like that in the American system, and that in recent decades we've done away with this idea that a woman's sexual history is admissible in a rape trial, past sexual history. But we still have a long way to go, and you know, my first job as a reporter was covering police, and in those days, there, you know, when you referred to a domestic, that meant, you know, that was low down on the priority, the list of priorities. That didn't rank as something important that had happened. And I do think that police and courts are doing better, and I know there have been serious and important attempts, but I really do think we still have a long way to go, especially for women to feel safe to report. I mean, when you look at the tiny number of college women who report in a situation in which the crime is very prevalent, we see how far we have to go to make women feel that there won't be reprisals, that they won't be harassed, that they won't really be, as we frequently say, raped all over again by the system, in being made to feel that they're the one who has done something wrong.
And what about the Violence Against Women Act? This is something that was reauthorized in the Senate last year, but the House bypassed it. It ended up expiring. What's happening with that?
Well, I have heard that there's some cautious optimism that it may be passed this time, but I personally think it's a disgrace that it wasn't reauthorized in the last Congress. Of course, we could say that there's feeling like that on many issues that weren't addressed in the last Congress, but this is one I think we can agree on, has always been easy to agree on. The issues, the obstacles, that the reasons that Republicans gave for the delay and in the end for why it wasn't taken up were, does this apply to immigrants? Does this apply to gay and lesbian couples? Does this apply on tribal lands? Was the final obstacle, and the one that it really came down to. But given the fact that several women die in the United States every day as a result of domestic violence, I really think a jurisdictional issue about who handles the cases on tribal lands is something that if we took it with the proper seriousness, we could get past.
Right. And I think it's important for journalists to note that the issue of rape on tribal lands is a huge one, and that if you are a Native American woman, your chance of being raped is greater than if you are some other group. There's also an International Violence Against Women Act that has not passed. What can you tell us about that, Stella?
Yeah, essentially, this one would be an endorsement for the U.S. government to be able to integrate issues of gender-based violence in the work that is done through development assistance and through their missions. So even if it hasn't been passed, on a positive note, very recently, as recent as November, maybe October, the U.S. government adopted a gender-based violence strategy, which should guide and inform efforts by the U.S. government on an international level to work with partner governments in addressing and integrating gender-based violence broadly, but including sexual assault and rape in the work of development assistance. And therefore, in that sense, this strategy having been adopted, I think reporters would do good if they followed through with different missions to kind of track how it's being implemented and enforced.
Great, and there are great story ideas there. So there is hope on the horizon, and this international act by the U.S. Is potentially a way to find those stories and dig into them outside of covering specific individual rapes. We know that a rape often causes physical injury, always leaves some kind of an emotional scar. We had a third guest who was going to be with us today, Joanna Connors, who was unable to make it because she got another assignment, so we're missing her today, but I did have an opportunity to talk with her yesterday. You'll find that interview on our website. It's about 10 minutes long, and it's very important to hear her voice. One of the things she told me was that many years after her rape, she was diagnosed by a therapist as having post-traumatic stress disorder. I think this is not that uncommon. In fact, there's a report by the DART Society, which is another resource that I would recommend to you. That report addresses sexual assault in the military, but one of the things it talks about is the potential harm that's caused by very aggressive reporting, or God forbid, inaccurate reporting about rapes. But how do you do that hard work of reporting? You have to confirm facts. You have to look for details. How do you do that without further traumatizing your subject?
Well, in this sense, I would speak to the international best practices that have been taken to handle these kinds of situations. The World Health Organization has issued guidelines for conducting interviews and research on situations of rape and sexual violence, as well as intimate partner violence. And I believe that these kinds of guidelines would be inspirational for reporters to work with, because again, they address issues of safety, confidentiality, make sure you do no harm, and issues like that. So I would say that's one way, or one of the working or promising approaches of good practices that have been adopted in this regard.
I think those sound very important, and I would only add that I also would like to see us act with the same compassion and sensitivity I hope we would use in any reporting situation, without making women feel like too different from anyone else. To go back to my other point, I really do think we should look to emphasize more that this crime is not necessarily someone that defines someone. That when we put too much emphasis on victimhood, I think we potentially make a mistake.
Well, that I think raises a good question, a huge question in reporting on rape and sexual violence, which is the question of anonymity. There's one question: when do you name an alleged perpetrator? And even more sensitive, of course, when do you name a victim? Thoughts?
I think it's easier to know when to name a victim, because that comes, and it's very well, at least in this country, very well, I think, understood that that's up to the victim to say when when it will be her or his choice to be recognized and to be named. When it comes to perpetrators, it's a lot more complicated. And the biggest question I've gotten in writing about the situation at Notre Dame has been, why haven't you named him? And I think, first of all, of course, writers don't make those decisions in a vacuum. That's up to a lot of people to make together at any news organization that's writing about an alleged assault. In my case, it was not actually a legal question. I wanted to focus more on the actions of university officials than I did on these one or two people. So I made the decision, along with the whole team at the paper, not to do that. But I know in a lot of situations, the legal aspect is, of course, very important too.
Right.
I agree with the ideas that Melinda is putting forward, and also to say that, in that situation, I would still go back to some of these guidelines, the international guidelines, because again, they do, they provide guidance on what underlies the decision on whether or not to name, and in some cases, it may be counterproductive to the safety of the victim concerned, because if they identify and have also identified the perpetrator, they may be exposed to further danger. And one of the key principles is do no further harm.
Mm-hmm.
The same applies to whether or not you should decide to name the perpetrator. I think some of these principles can be very inspirational in being able to decide whether or not these categories should be named in any case.
The downside, just to add one thing, the downside, of course, of not naming a perpetrator is I hear again and again, it's not a story unless you name the perpetrator. Of course, my personal belief is that the same people who say it didn't happen unless you name the perpetrator would be the ones to scream loudest if you did name that person.
Sure.
So no black and white answers, but the WHO guidelines are a good place to start.
And people take positions actually when you name, the Steubenville case. There are people who've come out and sworn that could have never happened, because they know the people, and that becomes problematic and controversial, and tends to put the blame back on the victim to really kind of bring the evidence and make the case as to whether or not this person that others know and hold in high regard really did that.
Right. Yes, that's a very good point. Can happen in some cases. We have a question from one of our viewers asking about whether you can share some best practices of rape crisis centers or crisis intervention centers in developing countries. Is that something you can speak to? Best practices.
Best practices. Right now, I can think of some in South Africa. I can come up with some names, but there is also a rape crisis center in Uganda called the Women's Crisis Center, and another one called Hope After Rape. In Kenya, in Nairobi, there is an organization called Liverpool LVCT, Liverpool Voluntary Counseling and Testing. They have set up centers in hospitals which provide HIV and AIDS services, but in that is integrated a component that will be able to respond to people who may be coming to test and can therefore be screened for rape or sexual assault and receive additional help other than the HIV services, like counseling, therapy, and in some cases they're actually linked to legal aid service providers. The legal aid service organizations in many countries are also operating as some form of crisis center, because when individuals, survivors come to report or seek advice on their cases, they are able to link them to other places where they can get the additional services they need.
Right. Well, those are some very good responses. The idea of combining HIV/AIDS services, legal aid services in one place, particularly in countries where transportation is difficult, there's a lot of poverty, it's hard to actually get in. So thank you for that. I think that addresses the question. Someone else wanted to know if we can talk about the way that in the U.S. the FBI reporting standards are going to be changing. My vague recollection on this is that there is a change in the definition of forcible rape that I think is going to end up having more assaults categorized as rape than in the past, and this may make it difficult to compare statistics one year to the next for a couple of years until the new standard has been in place. But don't take that as gospel. I'm not 100% sure that's what it is. Do you have any?
Well, we're trying to move away from this whole objectionable term, forcible rape, because rape, by definition, is forcible. And I think we have rightly concluded that, though everyone hasn't gotten the memo yet, that using that term, forcible rape, leaves the impression that there's some other kind. Of course, legally we still do have statutory rape on the books, but far and away that really is in a relative handful of circumstances that's ever prosecuted. So yes, they are doing away with that designation, thank goodness, in a way that will expand the term.
Okay. There is, I think, some very good work being done journalistically around this topic. What have you read that you've been impressed by recently?
I thought the Plain Dealer's work that was later echoed by the New York Times on the Steubenville case was a story that literally made me ill to read. But again, I think the challenge is to do that kind of story closer to home. I'd like to see us make more progress in that way.
So I apologize for the interruption. These are really difficult issues to tackle. Why are they so hard? What are some of the big obstacles to covering rape and sexual assault for reporters?
I think it's no fun to wade into. You will not be receiving many bouquets of thanks for doing so. And I think that sports writers in particular have to step up to the challenge. I think that you don't often see these issues handled very aggressively when they involve athletes by the sports writers who cover these people regularly, and I'd like to see more of that.
Melinda, you're going to get a lot of email from sports writers.
Okay.
I can assure you.
There are exceptions.
What are some other reasons? What about for a reporter covering a controversial rape? Are there threats? Is there bad email? What is it? How dangerous is it to be a reporter covering rape?
I have only been physically threatened in my many years in this field when writing about this topic. So to me, it was a bit of a surprise to be threatened when I've been writing about this. But yes, people are very defensive, and it will definitely get a lot of emotion.
And what about legal threats? What about a lawyer calling you up and saying, if you continue to write about this, I'm going to sue you for libel or something else?
I haven't.
That's the least of it.
It could be an excuse for somebody to say, okay, further reporting on this matter is sub judice, so don't delve into any further details and bring out, because you will compromise or jeopardize the judicial process. that could be something, but I haven't had many people argue around that.
Mhm.
I would say though that issues around the kind of stigma that survivors experience in society, can really jeopardize reporting, because within that is embedded the whole question of the silence, people not wanting to talk about it, not wanting to identify, and preferring to deal with it quietly and without exposing it for public consumption. That remains a big challenge for reporters, obviously, to be able to access the information. And the same also, in the same regard, is the challenge around the value attached to women and girls in a given society where the reporting is being done. Because if day-to-day rape is going on and nobody seems to recognize it as an issue because it's not an issue, then obviously your reporting is not newsworthy. And so there's no incentive or motivation for reporters in such a context to pick up and go on and on, although they should be, because the further you keep coming through with these kinds of messages, the more you should then be raising awareness for the community to say, okay, so why isn't this getting off the headlines, or why isn't it getting off page one, for people to be able to say, or to look up for a column that is dedicated to exposing issues of rape and sexual assault.
So you're saying that by putting the issue out there more often, in more ways, we can begin to erase some of the stigma.
Exactly.
We can make it easier to talk about. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And to help victims, to help end this feeling for once and for all that the victims have something to feel ashamed of. That's not something you want to reveal because it somehow reflects poorly on you.
In terms of different ways that we can report on rape, obviously a reporter can come in as a third party and pick up a police report and write about an individual incident. Joanna wrote about her rape in a first-person kind of way. You've had experience writing about your own rape. Is that, obviously you think the answer is yes, but how does that change the reporting on the issue? And is that a better way sometimes to come at the reporting on it?
It's one way. It doesn't have to be that way. I think there is underreporting both legally and in the media, and as we've said before, that the coverage is sometimes skewed. For example, there was an issue I wrote about recently about Congress also failing to pass something called the SAFER Act that I'm pretty sure to my knowledge, I'm the only one who reported on what to me was the shocking thing that Congress, having already authorized years ago millions of dollars to go to cut into the backlog of untested rape kits, DNA taken after rapes were alleged, that some of this money was being used for other purposes. We know that. There's a huge backlog. There's something like 400,000 untested rape kits. Well, that's not just a stat. That means that because we know rapists go until most of them keep going until they're caught, that's people who are on the street who could be off the street. That I can't imagine a more dramatic, and this is money that has already been authorized, something everyone in Congress in theory agreed on, and which would have cost the government $0. Could they agree? Could they actually pass this thing they said they agreed on? No, they could not. So that's an example of an issue that I thought was seriously undercovered, obviously.
And again, there's a very good story idea, at least for reporters in the United States. What is happening at your local police or sheriff's department? How many untested rape kits are sitting in filing cabinets there.
Those stories, I should say, have been done. There
Good.
have been a number of really good stories in LA, in Detroit. There a lot of individual outlets have looked at that. I was just talking about on the legislative side, I hadn't seen much attention, but there are a number of ways to look at the issue.
Good. What about attitudes in the newsroom? Is this a tough story to sell to an editor?
When I wrote this column, I have freedom to write, to pick my own subjects, and I was really heartened both by how supportive they were of my writing it and personal support afterwards. People were really warm, and that would, I think, maybe not have been the case years ago, which is why I, as a brand new reporter in a new city, that's one of the reasons I didn't report the rape at the time, because I felt that I would be looked at differently and that I would be marginalized in the newsroom. And when I look back now, I actually am even more convinced that that was an accurate assessment, I'm sorry to say. And I think that I'm thinking that that has changed. Of course, it's a lot easier to look back and say, it's a lot easier to be nice to someone who is not in the situation currently, is what I'm saying. And yet, I was not very surprised that after my column ran, a number of people who I know from a lot of different places said, "Oh yes, that's happened to me too." Again, because it's so common.
Right.
I wanted to say that perhaps a supportive editorial policy cannot be taken for granted across the board.
Yes.
And that in many instances it depends, it's a case-by-case basis, because if the perpetrator involved is a person of high regard, the policy can shift in another direction, depending on which interests are being protected, what interests the very paper has in relations with this person of high standing. And therefore, just to say that it can't be taken for granted. And the other thing I wanted to point to is the fact that because many people are not sensitized and cognizant that rape is actually commonplace, that many women are living and dealing with rape, it's that kind of thing. It may take a lot of convincing for a reporter in a given situation to be able to say to the editor, we think this reporting should come through.
Right.
Something that women said to me too, journalistic colleagues I've known from everywhere, said I too didn't report because I thought because of the same thing, because I wouldn't be taken as seriously at work, because they would look at me differently. So I heard that from women who worked in a lot of different places.
Given the obstacles that we've talked about to reporting on this issue, occasionally there are threats, victims are stigmatized, we want to be careful about that. Often there's a lack of information from police and also from victims. It's a very difficult thing to address. What are some ways that reporters can come at it, maybe not quite so head-on with a specific rape and a victim? What are some trends or larger ideas or other places that they might go to look for ways to write about rape and sexual assault in their city?
I think it's so... I'm trying to write about it less because I think it's so... There's something that catches my attention on that issue very regularly.
So you're trying to back off because you feel like you're over.
So I don't feel that I don't think I'm over reporting it, but I don't feel it's hard to find. I find that there are so many interesting, valid stories that touch on this issue that it's more a question of choosing.
We would love to hear examples if you have any you want to share with the audience.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, they're in the news all the time. I mean, I'm not, you know, I just feel that I could write about it far more regularly even than I do.
So one of our viewers is actually asking now, what does the press currently do very well when reporting on rape? And we've talked a little bit about the Steubenville coverage, which was impressive in the Plain Dealer, then in the New York Times, and lots of other places now. What specifically about that coverage was positive, was good journalism?
Because it was well reported. I think that there's, in this issue, as in any other issue, there's no substitute for reporting. And I think that sometimes in our opinion culture that we have now, there's the idea that, well, that's your opinion and this is my opinion and they're all equal. Well, no, there's such a thing as reporting, even reported opinion. So, you know, on this Notre Dame story, so when I hear from people saying, that's your opinion, this is mine, no, actually, the difference is one of us has done many months of reporting and has all the documents and one doesn't. So I think that what sets this kind of story apart as well done is no different from any other kind of story, something that's been very thoroughly reported.
Yep, well, those are words to live by, absolutely. Whose beat is it? Who's on the rape beat? You talked about the fact that sports reporters maybe need to be on this beat more often than they are or do a better job. But other than that, is it just up to the cops reporters in a newsroom? Should it be on everybody's beat? Who should be covering this? How should it be structured bureaucratically?
Well, to sort of clarify what I meant about sports writers, when you look, for example, at the Penn State case where it came from this woman, Sarah Ganim, who was not a sports writer, and I think that's frequently the case where you just don't see them taking the lead on this sort of thing, because it's perhaps understandable in one way in that when you cover someone every day, you might not have the same, and you cover them in a certain way, you cover how they're doing on the field, might be less likely to be as sensitive as you ought to be to some of these other things. I don't know that it should be on everybody's beat, but I think that it shouldn't only be the crime reporter, and it certainly shouldn't be ghettoized as only a women's issue.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
Are there any examples? You are very focused day to day, I believe, on Africa issues.
Africa and other parts of the world.
So is there reporting that you see that impresses you on this issue, or particular trends in the reporting of it that you feel good about?
I wouldn't say so. I think there's still a lot of room for improvement, especially the tone of reporting, because like I said, in many instances the reporting is about the death, a murder that has occurred, and the sexual assault is a secondary issue. The other one is the reporting that, the content that goes along with that and how it's presented. So if you get into a detail of how this person was dressed, for example, tending then to create already an impression in the mind of the reader, or reinforce the belief that because she wasn't dressed what is considered appropriate, she therefore deserved to encounter, or she was in a pub after 10 p.m. by herself, unescorted, therefore she, it's those details and which they bring nuances to the mind of the reader.
Right,
and I think
allowing
that
them to blame the victim
Exactly.
if that's already
that
their
needs to be
mindset.
improved.
Yeah, I would agree. One of our viewers says, this is not just about women who must bear witness, and she appreciates the comments that you just made. I'm wondering, as we're wrapping up here, are there issues around this, things that journalists should know or be thinking about that we haven't mentioned? I would say, as I mentioned earlier, the DART Society has some good resources on this on its website. Also, of course, the Pointer website has good resources for covering this and other issues. Any other resources that you all are aware of?
You know, resources. Women are a resource.
Thank you.
I was struck during the last campaign when we were about rape made by rape, run it past a woman. You know, maybe just don't. I mean, we really do have to talk about these things, and you know, I guess one silver lining of these remarks is that we're aware now of how far we still have to go.
And apart from individual women, also speak to women's organizations because they are dealing with these issues on a day-to-day basis. And
Absolutely. Well, I don't see any other questions coming. Find a recorded version on our website by tomorrow. That's www. Our website, a little button that says Donate Now. And if this has been helpful for you today and you feel so inclined, please click that button. We'll be happy to have any help that you can offer. Coming to you from Washington, D.C. for the National Press Foundation, Melinda Henneberger, thank you very much. Stella Mikasa, thank you. And we'll talk to you next